Good afternoon. I'm David Uy, Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum, DC, the first and only museum in our nation's capital dedicated to the Chinese American story. Today, we answer a few burning questions. Why are drivers stopped at red lights getting suddenly honked at when the light turns green? Or why are people walking on the sidewalk falling into open manholes? It may be because they're engrossed in a great podcast. We've all been there. But what makes a great podcast, and who are the brave souls that set out to create them? Today, we talked to some leading content creators in our Women Entrepreneur Series, Making Waves, podcasters, all made possible through the generous support of Ting Xu and James Xu of Evergreen Enterprises. If you want to ask questions during the event, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window, and we'll do our best to get to your submission. Also, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel in the upcoming days. So leading this discussion is our good friend, Joie Chen. Joie is a National Emmy Award-winning television journalist and journalism educator based in Washington, D.C. You may know her from her decade as an anchor and correspondent at CNN and CNN International, and she remains active in journalism and diversity education. And she served on the boards of her alma mater, the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University, as well as the Elon University School of Communications, the Freedom Forum, and most recently in the senior leadership of the Poynter Institute. So Joie, thank you for getting us started.
Oh, David, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate all of you out there for joining us, and particularly these really smart women who we will all learn a lot from in this hour. Thank you so much for being here. I want to jump right into it. You'll see bios of all of our participants in the chat as well. And also, we're going to follow up with details, so you don't have to write down the names of their podcasts now, but I want to get right into the conversation because there's a lot to learn and not enough time. There's never enough time. Joining us this hour is Dr. Xine Yao, whose podcast is PhDivas, Sheena Yap Chan, whose podcast is the Tao of Self Confidence, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong, Color of Success. We'll find out why that's important, that Jay. And Connie Steele, Strategic Momentum. Ladies, if we could begin with a quickie here, 30-second elevator pitch style. There are 2.5 million podcasts. 2.5 million podcasts out there. Tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of episodes out there for people to listen to. So I'd like to get like a quick note on 30 seconds just on why I should want to, what is your podcast aimed at? Why should I be listening to? Who do you want to listen, and why are you doing it? And you can do that each in 30 seconds. Stephanie, start with you.
Thank you, Joey. Our podcast is Color of Success, and it is the intersection between mental health and entrepreneurship. It started during the pandemic, and we really looked at people working from home and starting their own businesses. And really, I asked the question, what about mental health? I've long been a cultural broker for the community about resources and being a provider. And my joke is, I can't be your provider because A, you can't afford me, and B, you're my uncle. But in all seriousness, we want to break down those barriers about having conversations about mental health in our communities, because a lot of people think if you talk about this, you're crazy, which isn't the case.
Sheena, how about you take up your 30 seconds? Tell us your story.
Yeah, hi everyone. So honored to be here. So my name is Sheena Yap Chan. I have a podcast called The Tao of Self Confidence, which is right here, where I interview Asian women about their journey to self-confidence. And I started this podcast in 2015 when there was like maybe one other Asian person podcasting at the time. My main reason why I created it was because back then when I was looking for resources to cater to Asian women's confidence, I couldn't find any. And so part of me always felt like something was wrong with me because I was dealing with so many confidence issues, but really it's because our upbringing always tells us never to talk about our problems, never to talk about the issues we go through. And so I started the podcast as a support system and also representation, because for me, representation is really important, especially when you grow up in a city where there was no representation, even though the city I live in is one of the most multicultural cities in the world. And so that is why I started my podcast, for representation and also support. I really wanted to share Asian women's stories about their strengths, the things they had to overcome to be who they are today. And I've interviewed over 700 Asian women from around the world, from different backgrounds, different parts of the world, different careers. So, yeah.
Yeah, I do have to note that in looking at all of your archives, all of you, it is impressive and amazing to me that there are so many voices. There's so many voices represented, largely people of color and particularly Asians. And I'm struck by there's not that much duplication, right? Like there are all these voices that haven't been heard, and you are giving voice and platforming to all of these individuals who are maybe not heard from in other media. So I want to applaud all of you for that. Connie, let's go to you. Tell me about your podcast.
Sure. So my podcast is called Strategic Momentum, and it's about helping professionals achieve meaningful work-life fit in an ever-changing world through these inspiring stories, actual tips, and pragmatic advice from those that found it. And we showcase forward-thinking leaders, entrepreneurs, and creators on how they broke through the inertia that they faced personally and professionally. It's something that I think so many of us have been dealing with throughout our careers. And most importantly, it's focusing on how they redefined success, the almost roadmap that they took to help them progress the way that they wanted. And the reason why I started this was for my own consulting business. I was seeing it as an opportunity to create thought leadership content, to showcase people's voices where in so many circumstances at work and in our life, we aren't sure how to deal with these sticky, tricky situations. And I wanted to present a very holistic perspective on how different people approached it. So it wasn't just a subject matter area that was narrow, like marketing or product development. It was the psychology behind it. It was the team dynamics behind it. And as a result, it led to really interesting understanding and theses of how people were approaching work fundamentally differently, and how the future of work from a human-centered perspective was evolving. So I wanted to showcase really those voices of how we as human beings really want to find our fit, because it's the only way we're going to be fully happy in this new world of work.
That's a lot to cover. And I think one thing that's interesting and makes a good transition to Dr. Xine Yao on this is, I was completely engrossed in an episode you did about the chair. This is a web series about, Sandra Oh is the lead character in it, and she plays the chair of the newly declared chair of department. And, this is that evolution that Connie talks about. That's how do we succeed? I mean, there's so many parallels around this, but tell us more about your podcast side.
Well, greetings from London, England. Thank you for having me despite the time difference. So PhDivas Podcast is what happens when you get a Chinese-Canadian literary critic meeting an African-American cancer scientist. And so with my co-host, Dr. Liz Wayne, the podcast really tracks our development as PhD students through to being professors today. And on the way, we found that we had so many things in common to talk about from very different disciplinary angles and very, very different lived experiences. And so on our podcast, we discuss everything from disability, migrant rights, labor organizing, but also how are standards of evidence different in the sciences versus in literary studies. On the way, we interview lots of other fascinating women academics in and outside of academia, from astrophysics, archaeology, and art history. We talk about so many different disciplines, from marine biology to space science, but also, as you could hear, have time to talk about pop culture like The Chair, or in a recent episode, Sailor Moon. So if you want to hear about academia, culture, and social justice across the STEM humanities divide, tune into PhDivas Podcast.
All right. Yeah, that was good promo and well done there. All right. I can't put too fine a point on this, but we are all AAPI women of Chinese descent. This is an event sponsored by the Chinese American Museum, and shout out to them for doing that, as well as Evergreen Enterprises, as well for their sponsorship of this particular conversation, which elevates the voices of Chinese women in the podcast world to the fore on this. And I wonder how, interestingly, none of you specifically address being Asian in the names of your podcasts. I'm assuming that there's some reason for that. I'm assuming that you're trying to send some kind of message with that, but I'm also curious how your ethnicity impacts, how it differentiates your podcast from others. What is different about that? Sheena, start with you.
Yeah, thanks for that great question. And so for me, I didn't put Asian in the title. Actually, when I was starting my podcast, I saw a lot of titles that was like the art of. And I was like, okay, instead of using the art of, I wanted to use something different, right? Which I use the Tao, because the Tao means the way, right? And so the way to self-confidence is really whatever way it looks like for you, because we're all different. We're not going to have the same way of building our own confidence. And this is why I've interviewed so many women on this topic of confidence, because even though there's similarities, everyone has a different story. Everyone has a different way of building confidence. And, you could use it and see if it works for you. And I think what sets that apart is just being able to interview so many women over the years, so many Asian women, when podcasting for Asians wasn't as huge in 2015 as it is now, right? And so a lot of people are like, you're the OG. I was like, I don't think I'm the OG. Maybe I'm the more visible one because I just talk about it constantly. But I think that's what sets it apart is, having a platform showcasing all these amazing Asian women who've been through divorce, bankruptcy, sexual abuse, even women who were born with no legs, no arms, being able to, meet people like Bill Clinton and work for Obama. I mean, really different ways to live life and realize like it's okay to color outside the lines, right? Especially when we come from an upbringing where women are just supposed to do one thing.
All right, Connie, to speak to that, I think that resonates with you as well.
Absolutely. I was going to piggyback off of that because when you said, Tao being the way and whatever way should be your way, which is absolutely, I think, what people do want in, again, this new world of work is to be their whole self. And I believe that all of us want to be quite inclusive and mindful of how each of us are different. And for me, it wasn't a consideration to identify that I'm a Chinese American. Just see me as me. I just happen to be a female. I happen to be Chinese American. I happen to have unique perspectives that may enable me to connect with somebody who is also a person of color, who is also a person who is an immigrant, who also happens to maybe have some characteristics and attributes that we can relate to, but maybe not, and that's okay. So for me, it's trying to be as inclusive and open and holistic as possible in the way that I try to understand the individual that I'm speaking to. And I think because I am an Asian American, I am able to look at things through a certain lens versus maybe somebody else.
Steph, your practice particularly does focus on AAPIs and the mental health needs of the community. And yet you talk about the color of success in the title of your podcast. Speak to this question of, where are you? What are you presenting? Are you presenting as a Chinese American woman? Are you presenting, what is it that you're trying to reach and express to us in your podcast?
I think Asian American and AAPI guests are central to our podcast. And at the same time, to truly embody diversity, equity, and inclusion, I also don't want to exclude individuals from other ethnic minority groups. We've had Black African American guests and Asian Indian Americans. And so I really just want to highlight that this is a cross-cultural issue of talking about mental health. Of course, it does impact AAPI, Asian Canadian communities, but we also want to open up conversations about what are these communities really facing. We've had content experts come on the show, for instance, about suicide prevention, needle phobia, and one of them is not AAPI, but he is an expert in suicide prevention, which can then help multiple communities.
Xine, you are the co-host of PhDivas, and your partner in this enterprise is an African American woman, and so you are really reaching across that divide in a very literal sense in the podcast.
Yes, and because of course we know that divas are fabulous, or PH divas are a particular type of fabulous, and I think it's great to be able to associate both, Chinese women like myself, and of course Black women like my colleague Dr. Liz Wayne, with the type of particular fabulousness that is PH divas. I guess more specifically to thinking about Chinese Americanness, though, I actually work on 19th century American Asian American literature, which means working on the first Asian American women writers who are actually of Chinese descent. And they were the first women to publish in English in North America, in both the US and Canada. And so I think I bring a lot of that history and understanding how Asian American history and Chinese history is also deeply interwoven with other struggles with other peoples of color. And that's sort of the type of interdisciplinary knowledge that I try to bring to our discussions, even as Liz is the one who understands how the math and the science works.
I want to get to sort of the nuts and bolts of putting together podcasts, but I think first maybe talk about the bolts or the hurdles and challenges of starting a podcast, of knowing that you've got enough to say to fill up a podcast, because I think that's a thing that holds people back. Do any of you, have you thought about this? Or was that an impediment to your saying, oh heck, I'm going to go for it?
I'll share my thoughts. I know that once I decided I was going to do a podcast, and of course there was a lot of imposter syndrome that came into play first before committing, it was ensuring I had a plan. I was being very thoughtful and putting together everything I could think of that I knew would be important to ensure that I could have the best product, for lack of a better term, out there, because there was this fear of not doing well, a fear of failure. So almost probably over preparing, like preparing for a test in college and studying and doing every single thing that you would need to do.
Please don't fall to Asian stereotypes.
I know. But it's one of those things where I just felt that I needed to be fully prepared. And so once I committed, it was documenting everything, thinking through, the experience. And that's what helped me get started.
Sheena, how did you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think mine was at a different time because this is 2015. There's probably like 5 other Asians who were podcasting. And so for me, it was really hard to start, not because of the technical issues, but it was more of the mindset issues, like what Connie mentioned, imposter syndrome, feeling good enough, knowing if what I was creating was really bad or really good. I'll share a little story. When I started podcasting, I actually invested to be in a mastermind because I had no idea what it was. I had no clue what a podcast was. I just saw it on Apple iTunes at the time. And so before I had this title, I actually was going to name it The Stripper and have a tagline to strip away your limiting beliefs. And so I had someone create a podcast graphic with literally a silhouette of a stripper with a whip. And I'm so glad I invested in that. I was trying to be clever. So I'm really grateful for that mastermind, because when I sent that graphic, they're like, you're gonna bring in
a different audience than you might have intended.
It's not clear enough, right? And so at that time, I was like, I'm a total failure, because if I can't even get the title right, how am I going to get the show right? And so I just had to take a step back, get super clear, and then come up with this title. And so when I sent this title with this graphic, they were like, this is it. This is it. I can't wait for your podcasts. So being able to make mistakes is okay, because we all make them. It doesn't have to be perfect. Even until now, it's not perfect. I just put it out there. And when we let go of the perfection, it just makes things a lot easier. We move forward more. We take action in our own journeys, and this applies not just in podcasting, but everything else in life. I know it's easier said than done, because we've been programmed to always show up as the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, that perfect person. But, that's just someone's perception. It's not someone's truth. So that's why it's so important to surround yourself with like-minded women like this panel, who went out there, who forged the path, who showed you it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fail forward, right? It's okay
It's also okay to seek help. I mean,
it's also okay to seek help. That's the most important, because that's something we're not taught as well, right? I mean, my own family is like, you shouldn't be asking for a handout. That's really shameful. But is it really? Like, especially if you're providing something to the world that's creating a positive impact. So it was really more mindset shift and realizing that I saw one Asian guy who had a podcast when I was starting about, empowering our community. And really, I just needed to see him, and that helped me realize, okay, I'm going to do it. Because if he's doing it, then I can do it. And, I always tell him, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah, Stephanie, I want to ask you about this because I think about this cultural hurdle that we may have to overcome. I would feel this way about it. I know that in my television career, I think that my parents, my mother in particular, always had this sort of, ooh, that's a little too public. That is a little too, yes, it's good and we're proud that you're successful, but it's a little bit too much for you as an Asian woman to be like, maybe you should be a little less visible, which is kind of difficult when you're on television, but try to be less visible, and that would be more appropriate. Do you encounter this in yourself or in the community around you? Do you have that sense of maybe the community is somewhat uncomfortable with this, or maybe I'm afraid of that?
Right, all the time. And my inspiration, though, are my two young daughters, because I want them to have a voice. I want them to know that despite their stimulus value, that they can have an opinion and put that out there. And of course, I always reference BTS. It's in the background on my pillow and all that. But, Kim Namjoon really talks about, if our existence can fight xenophobia, then that's enough. And so putting my face out there, while it's very uncomfortable, and taking pictures in front of my princess tree during the pandemic, it is something that people can see. Just like Sheena mentioned, when she saw Ken Fong, that inspired her to do something. And I always am surprised that the listeners that are out there are more than my mother. And so, that really inspires you when you get those letters and they say, this has had an impact on me. I'm a mother who's transitioning back to being a therapist in private practice, and listening to you overcome a lot of your barriers and hearing other people jump back in to the workforce after having children is really symbolic. And, PhDivas, like, we are divas because we also know what it's like to be broke. And I will, warning, Chinese American stereotype, I am still very cheap, even no matter how much money I make. And so I really started because Dr. Melvin Varghese of Selling the Couch podcast had a free class and course. And I've used his podcast actually to be a template to start my own private practice in 2016. And he was like, this is the mic that you should get. This is the lighting you should consider, and using this platform to upload. So I think there are a lot of resources out there that are really trying to encourage people. And I said, if it doesn't work out, then what's the risk? I then continue to be a psychologist working with veterans and the Asian American community here in a different way. But this resource is free for other people.
Yeah. Time, can you speak to this experience, like this, who is being touched by what you're saying, and how does that motivate you?
I think that's a great question, but I also think that the underlying answer from all of us is community, that we all see ourselves as the podcast coming out of community and speaking to community. And for Liz and I, that was very much the case, not just about finding each other, but we were having these conversations as PhD students, but also at the same time as actually part of a collective of Asian North American scholars who are all different disciplines, and we're all reading a lot of Asian American feminism. And we ended up going on this college radio at Cornell to discuss it. And then I had a friend, both Liz was listening in, but also another friend who's also African-American, Dexter. And he said, Xine, I think you'd make a great podcaster. And I said, actually, I think I should do it with Liz. And so brought her on. And then he was basically our producer. At the time, he was doing his PhD too, but he was also doing all this producing and DJing on the side. And what's been wonderful since then is seeing the different success routes that we've all had since then. Like Liz is also a professor now. She also became a TED fellow. Our friend Dexter, who was our early producer, he works for Vice and he's won both an Emmy and a Pulitzer. So there's also the sense of like helping each other and everyone getting to benefit with this sort of success.
Wow, that really is neat. Can you, so we've talked about this idea of reaching out and getting whatever professional help in establishing your podcast. Is it expensive to start a podcast? Does it take investment? Any of you?
Yeah, I mean, of course, anything takes investment, right? And it doesn't have to be a huge investment. Really, all you need is a microphone, a really good microphone like this microphone I'm using. I've used it since I recorded my first podcast, and it still works till today. So once you have that, and also you really have to invest in podcast hosting, because the podcast hosting is where you would have all the different directories be sent to them: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play. So those are the two of the most important things. Some of the other things you can get is actually, free on the internet, like to promote your, to edit your stuff, or to even, you can use Zoom to record your calls. There's so many different ways to record it. But the most important, I tell people, is they need a good mic, right? Because your voice has to pop out. It doesn't have to be the loudest voice, but you can just talk calmly and people can still recognize your voice. And then podcast hosting, if you want to be visible, if you want to be picked up by Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, you definitely need that. So
yeah, how did you guys get to your hosting platforms? Connie, how did you do that?
Well, for me, it was talking to somebody that I knew that was doing podcasting and really just going with a referral. I knew absolutely nothing about podcasting. I'd read about the medium, and from my vantage point where I was looking to really establish authentic thought leadership content, for me, it represented something about where I thought was record one, syndicate many, just in a really efficient and effective way to create content, because you have this amazing conversation and you could have it on video and then audio, transcribe it into written content and short snippets for social. And I just thought this could be a great way to create just valuable information for people. So really just referrals.
Yeah. So and you say you did have the advantage of somebody who led you into it.
Yeah, but I guess I'd say that I would lower the bar even more. The most important thing is creating content. It doesn't matter how good it is, but it's just about getting used to doing it, and hearing your own voice is in itself extremely jarring. So I think that if you want to do a podcast for real, like definitely invest, as Sheena said, in the microphone, get guidance, but also just start off with like using your voice notes app and just talking about an issue and listening back to yourself, sending it to other people, just thinking about that on this very small level, about having confidence in speaking for yourself and listening to yourself and going from there.
Did you have any doubts that you'd have enough to say?
Yes, and that's why I decided to do it with a friend, because the sort of imposter syndrome that people have, and particularly if you're a woman of color, you tend to have about whether or not your voice can be authority. Like the thing is, I didn't necessarily believe in myself, but I believed in Liz, and the feeling was also vice versa. And there's this sort of solidarity in that even if we weren't sure about what we were doing or what sort of authority we were, if we spoke well on the microphone, we believed that the other person did. And so because of that, we sort of helped to lead each other on. And it sort of ends up being sort of a tag team effort of making something.
Mm-hmm. I also want to note, just for people who don't know and might be curious, I mean, a lot of these USB microphones, ones that will plug directly into your laptop and will allow you to improve the quality of your sound, are, in the $100 to $200 range today. So in terms of investment, we may not be talking about if you hadn't purchased this kind of equipment before, even buying equipment is not necessarily going to be the biggest impediment to this. Stephanie, can you speak to this, as Xine was just talking about, this kind of idea that maybe we don't have enough to say, or who wants to listen to me? I mean, why would you want to listen to me? What do I know? I gotta wonder how this limits us, and is there any particular cultural impediment to doing that, to getting over that hurdle?
Well, I think here's my problem and my strength is I have a lot to say, but I like many social interactions, and I teach my clients when I don't have anything to say, I rely on the other person and bring out their thoughts and their ideas. And I think that's part of being a great podcaster, is really having that active listening and seeing where the direction of the conversation goes. I mean, Joey, you're very, very humble. And at the same time, you're like a pro and expert in drawing out this information from us, right? I mean, for some of us, we just met like last week, and to be able to have cohesion is a skill. And I think bringing on guests that really resonate with your message and that really connect with you. I mean, guest selection is just so important.
Yeah. How do you get a good guest? Because I am struck by this and listening to all of your podcasts. I mean, I'm thinking, well, did they have like 10 crappy guests and they just didn't post those? Or are all your guests good by the time you get them on the microphone?
I think it does differ, right? At first it was like, hey friends, do you want to be on the podcast? And then from there, as you get more visibility as well, you have people reaching out, you have PR companies proposing guests. And then I was like, wow, I have to make a guest request form to see if this guest fits well with the show, and maybe offer them other platforms if maybe I don't see it as a full interview, maybe a live, or putting them out there in an IG post or something like that. So I think just creating processes.
How about the rest of you?
Yeah, I did a lot of outreach in the beginning, especially when you start with nothing, you're not sure if people are gonna say yes. I mean, I always led with the purpose of the show, because that was really important, because nobody knows who I am, but they love the purpose, right? To elevate Asian women, to empower our community. And so being able to lead with that, I've been able to speak to so many Asian women, right? And so it was nerve-wracking, of course, because anything you do that's new is like uncomfortable. You second guess yourself, you overthink. You don't know if they'll say yes or no. And sometimes you got to be okay with if they reject you, right? And I'll ask anybody. I even asked like the PR team for Dr. Pimple Popper and got rejected. But at least I went for it, right? Versus not going for it and saying, what if? But then as people got to know about the podcast more, I started getting referrals, really good referrals, and, people reaching out. And then now I've been a little bit more selective. I want to make sure the story does make sense. It can really help someone out there. Like my latest episode is about a Filipino woman who has a high rank in the Army, in the US Air Force, and talks about the microaggressions she went through, the stereotypes, the racism, because let's face it, right? When someone looks at us, they don't see us as someone in a higher corporate position or higher ranking leadership role. They see us as the nanny, or, someone getting coffee, or the help. And so this is why, creating this podcast was really important for me, to really have a stronger representation of Asian women and dismantle all the negative stereotypes we go through.
Or just the biases that exist in our daily lives. Connie, I think you can really relate to what Sheena is talking about there, this notion that women, Asian women in particular, are not presumed to be the woman in charge.
Absolutely. Having been a marketing executive myself in technology, where in most instances, they would be seen as the engineering support side, right? And so in marketing, you have to have your voice. You're looking to create the brand of the company. You're the face of the company. So when I have been
in a podcast, you are the brand.
Absolutely. So much of this is us building our brands, establishing our voices, and that is incredibly intimidating. So for me, having done this in a profession for a company, that's one thing. But when it's for me individually, different part of the brain, just emotionally, lots of barriers that I had to face myself. I didn't like hearing my voice. In fact, I wanted to edit it out of everything and then re-record it and make sure it sounded perfect. I had to get over that myself. So, it's very challenging putting yourself out there because you're open to being criticized, right? And you have to build that level of confidence, as Sheena has been so wonderful in showcasing that, such that you feel you've got something to say and people want to hear you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you were talking about this earlier, this notion of your own your own identity, your own voice, and your own ability to hear yourself and speak yourself, but also to put yourself out there, right? Like to put your personal hurts, all that vulnerability. People know that I do this all the time, but I will just throw in sort of, okay, so I watched the last night of The Bachelorette last night. I'll like fully disclose, that whole emphasis on the vulnerability. What are you willing to put out there that particularly in the social world, is going to be target of any troll who wants to be out there? I mean, that's a big hurdle in and of itself.
Definitely. And I think that being women of color in the public sphere is more dangerous than ever. And I've definitely experienced blowback, and I've seen pretty much all women of color that I know who've spoken up publicly in some way, shape, or form has at some point had to deal with trolls. And I think it becomes really interesting. I think it helps you to really have to take charge of your mental health, as Stephanie has been so beautifully articulating, but also how do you build community? How do you build strategies? How do you translate, the good fuzzy feelings of community that you want to build with the community into concrete actions and strategies to protect yourself, but also to protect other people? And I guess that's also why, like, when I think about how Liz and I are negotiating our vulnerability, we're also thinking about what things we don't want to share, and also being transparent about that. I think it's easy for us to do the podcast now that we are professors, but when we were PhD students, we weren't sure if we're going to finish our PhDs. We weren't sure if we're going to get jobs in academia. And I think that there's something about being honest about those negotiations, not pretending that we're always being vulnerable, because that's also kind of a lie, but knowing that we can build a community of people that can understand what we're trying to negotiate in terms of how much of yourself you reveal at different moments is incredibly important. And I guess that's why, to go back to the question about guests, I don't think we don't really accept guests that we don't know. Like, for us, it's very much about relationships, and it's about building relationships with people, and that's how we decide whether or not we want to have people on.
We're already starting to get questions in the Q&A. We weren't supposed to get to them until a little bit later, but I just feel like we should start to go there, because we do hear good voices. Thank you to Rachel Huey, who's already talking about both Stephanie, BTS, and sharing your stories so far. A message from an anonymous attendee, though, interests me a lot. This person asks, I have a daughter who is just starting college. Although I'm encouraged by the first-gen emphasis and resources available by various schools, my concern is lack of confidence displayed by first-gen high school students. Do you know of any podcast resources that hit that particular age group? Any of you? I guess this also goes to like how we share like knowledge of all these 2.5 million podcasts out there. Which ones could really be useful? Is there a way to find really good ones, and particularly on this participant's question for that first-gen high school student?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've had guests who are teenagers, who are children, and to be honest, they have more wisdom than most adults. And I'm just like 9 years old or 18 years old, how do you have so much wisdom already? So being able to listen to that, and there's a lot of kids out there right now too who are podcasting, and I think being able to find that age range group can really help that person realize I'm not the only one who deals with this. Especially like high school is not fun if you're being bullied, if you're not the cool person, and so we need those support systems, right, to share like you're not the only one who feels like an outcast, or you're not the only one who's different, and it's okay to be different, right? I know going to high school now versus me going to high school back then is totally different because we had no social media. And so everything now is intensified with social media, and how do we cope with that? So there are kids out there in that age range group that are also creating podcasts, having that platform, talking about these issues as well. And I think it's just really Googling or researching or just asking around. But one thing I really love is having guests from all ages, right? To showcase like, we can learn confidence from a 9-year-old, from an 18-year-old, from a 28-year-old, 38 and beyond.
Yeah. Steph, I want you to answer this question too, because I know that you're in South Bay area. So you are encountering a lot of young people in that region, but I guess I think a lot about the experience of trying to reach different audiences in television media. And so I wonder if you guys know who your audience is. Can you chart demos? Can you tell who it is you're reaching, and what is the best way to reach more of that group, whether it's a particular age group or gender, or can you tell, and can you align your programming that way, or do you even want to do that?
I think it's important to sometimes look at the demographics. Again, I try to stay away so much from metrics just because I think you can get hyper focused on that. But going to that question too of the mother and her daughter, you are also a huge influence on your daughters about having conversations, about breaking down barriers. And one of the great things about it is it's not just podcasts, it's reading Asian American authors, learning about our history. We recently had the creator of Awesome Asian Americans who do comic book type historical compilation of notable Asian Americans in history. That's the stuff that's not in school. We had Vincent Yi on that created this whole fantasy series with multi-ethnic Asians as the main characters. So I think really seeing yourself in that sense will really build up self-confidence. But I also want to underscore, it's not a bad thing to seek help, to talk to a therapist. It's not necessary if you're clinically diagnosed, but if you are struggling with self-esteem, seek someone who can really help you work through that, because we don't necessarily know exactly what is the issue. We can say, oh, it's because you're an Asian American young woman, but like Sheena alluded to, it could be bullying. It could be, the way that they dribble a basketball, which happened to my daughter yesterday because she's small. And I said, who cares? Just shoot the way you want to shoot, but you have to have that backing from your support network to say, these are the things that you're going to face. Is it really impactful? And who is the source? It's harder with social media. Don't get me wrong. I would not want to be a kid right now, but we have to help them traverse this very complicated world as parents.
Yeah. And Xine, in the academic environment, I mean, this comes up a lot. Even in my limited experience in the academy, I just am struck by they are a whole different generation of student, and the challenges there are significant.
Yeah, I think that's why we can't talk about imposter syndrome enough. And also should know that's not, imposter syndrome isn't just about individuals feeling insecure. It's also about whole cultures, whole structures that are making people feel that way, but also trying to think about how to rework it. So what if you're first generation? What if you're the only person of color, the only woman of color in a space? Are you an imposter, or are you smart enough to have infiltrated the space that you're never supposed to be in the first place? Perhaps you're a spy. Perhaps being an imposter is actually just the way of thinking it from the wrong way around. And in fact, you're doing something that's even more dangerous, even more exciting. And if you think about it in that sort of sense, it actually shows to you the credentials that you had that still managed to get you into the door, despite having to go across all the different barriers of expectations of what someone is supposed to look like when they're in a particular institution. And I think I really want to reinforce what people just said about navigating how to find the resources, not just about telling you which resources, but perhaps increasing resource literacy and digital literacy. And what if we do have a good podcast, how it's not just about listening to them, but how to talk about it critically. So when you find those podcasts, and I'm afraid I can't recommend any specifics, but when you do, try to also set up being able to have conversations with what do they talk about? Do they actually talk about, when they talk about resources, or they talk about history, or they talk about numbers, do they use sources? Can you actually tie it to news stories? I think it's also not just about your daughters listening to women their age, but also about, of course, this cross-generational conversation and having them develop the critical skills to understand how to navigate whatever media they come across on whatever platform it is.
I want to turn to other questions that we're getting in the Q&A. I think a lot of you could answer this from different perspectives. One of our attendees says, I'm currently looking for a full-time job, How should I stay confident and hopeful that there's an opportunity out there for me? We don't know whether this person is looking for their first full-time job or is returning to the job market, but maybe Connie, you can speak to this first. This notion of how do you stay confident and hopeful that there's a path ahead?
I think so much of that starts with you also having clarity on what it is you're looking to get out of the full-time job. What is your goal? So if you're looking for a job to get a job, then the pursuit of an opportunity is going to be really broad and unfocused, and that may come across in your interview. If you're very clear in what it is you're looking for and why, fundamentally why, ask yourself that. Are you pursuing a particular profession because it enables you to build skills in a certain area which you are passionate about? Again, what is that elevator pitch that clearly conveys the reason why and the value that you are going to deliver to an organization, and ultimately the value it's going to deliver to you? Then you're going to increase your likelihood of being able to land the right job that's the right fit. But if you don't have clarity yourself, then inevitably you're going to likely have struggles, because that narrative that you tell different people that you interview with might change depending on what that opportunity is.
Yeah. Sheena, I will say to you, in full disclosure, our son has just graduated from college himself. He is looking for his first job. He is in that cohort of people trying to figure out how do I, and I, one thing that really strikes me is he has a perception that I didn't have. I thought when I got out of college, I wanted to get a job. I would take the job that was, he's actually turned down a job, which was like at that age, I would have gone, what? But he said it was not the right fit for him. And that this to me seems like an important factor to understanding how you maintain your self-confidence, how you maintain your understanding of self. Although as a mother, I got to say, you turned down a job, what?
I know my parents would have said the same thing. I mean, they were really livid when I decided to quit my job and just started to forge my own path. So that's a whole other story. But when it comes to confidence, it's really, an everyday thing that you have to build, right? It's not like you build it on a Monday, take a rest on a Tuesday. That's something you need to build on every single day, because there's a lot of things we need to unlearn. There's a lot of things that have been programmed in our heads that's stopping us from moving forward. So I think it's learning to work on it, work on your mindset, connecting with people who have a positive impact on you versus the opposite, right? And I'm not saying you have to be positive all the time, because that's just not, that doesn't make sense, right? We're going to go through self-doubt, imposter syndrome. We're going to have negative thoughts, and that's okay. And we need to find an outlet to let that out. So like Stephanie said, like therapy isn't a bad thing, right? If that's the outlet you need to let it out so you have new energy coming in, then do that, right? There's no shame in it, right? I know in our culture, it's seen as, oh, something's wrong with you. Oh, you're crazy. Or, I have family members who say, oh, mental health doesn't exist. It's a myth, and so we have to learn that, we all go through some form of mental health issue, and that's okay, right? Especially during the pandemic, especially during the Stop Asian Hate movement, it's intensified because of those two things, even more so for women, because Asian women have been targeted 2.5 times more than men. So of course we're feeling all these things, right? And that's why having an outlet is so important, whether it's to talk to a mental health professional, talk to your best friend, read a book, listen to a podcast, attend a panel like this. This is all part of your work, right? Even if it means just binge watching on K-drama, that's fine, right? If that's your way of just healing through the process, then do it, right? What's the best thing about it is trying to figure out what works for you, because like I mentioned, what may work for me might not work for Connie or for Stephanie or for Xine or for Joie, but it may work for you. So
K-drama has saved my life. I'm sorry.
Yeah, mine too. But yeah, trying to figure things out, working on yourself every single day, and practicing, right? Practice makes progress. Like, I didn't become a podcaster overnight. I had to interview over 700 Asian women to get to where I am today. So nothing happens overnight. Everyone always sees the story and the glory, but never hears like the story behind it, the hardships we went through, the hours of like trying to figure out how to edit a podcast, or days where you're like, you just want to throw your laptop across the wall because technology sucks sometimes, right? And that's all normal things that we go through. So being able to practice makes progression. That's how you can build confidence, because you've practiced your craft so many times.
So a pertinent question actually coming to us from the chat, which can you guys go over to the Q&A because that would help me. But a lot of content creators speak about the pressure to constantly produce a steady stream of programming. Do those demands weigh on you, or is your podcast on your own schedule? And I'd ask as a corollary to that, if you were starting out with a podcast, do you build up a library before you launch? Do you think you should have? And Sheena, I know you actually took a break this year, right? You actually.
I take a season break every year. For me, it's just because back then I decided to do like 5 shows a week, which I would not recommend for anybody, but I'm crazy sometimes. I just said, I'm going to create, a really big platform where there's so many diverse Asian women sharing their struggles and how they're able to overcome it. And then as I reach a certain number of episodes, I said, I'm going to go from five shows a week to 1 show every 2 weeks, because there's enough out there. There's enough out there to listen to binge listen, to download. And I also take season breaks because I figure if TV shows can do it, why can't I? Right. So it's really following my way of doing things. And if people don't like it, then, that's fine, because I can't please everyone. Right. We're going to have haters. We're going to have people who are going to say your voice is annoying, or your content sucks, or you keep saying right all the time. And that's okay. Right. Just remember those people who are, the haters, the keyboard warriors, half the time they're just out there complaining about life, not really doing anything. And, whatever action you take, you're always going to run into those things. So you have to learn to build a thick skin and just move forward with that, and know that what you're doing is creating a bigger purpose. So yeah, for me, I do my own thing. I like to have season breaks. I'll change it up if I want to, and then, most people haven't said anything. So
both Connie and Sutton, you both had sort of professional, whatever podcast professional help is in getting started. Was there a recommendation that you have like 10 episodes in a can or whatever before you launch?
There was just more to prepare for that cadence. The most important advice I had was consistency. So ensure that you are publishing on a regular basis, whatever that looked like. So in planning that, I realized, all right, well, let me get, a few shows, at least 1 to 2 before I start that process. But like Sheena, I actually went with 1 podcast a month and realized, well, that's not enough. After doing 4, went to 1 every other week and did that for a couple of years and realized, wow, that's still a lot going through the entire year. And then shifted ultimately to doing seasons. So I take a break in the winter, and I take a break during the summer. So there's consistency in the fall period and in the spring. But that was really to adapt to what my schedule would be best, because it is a significant amount of work to consistently do it. And I wanted to do it with quality, like all of us do.
When you say it's a significant amount of work, do you have a staff for the podcast? How many hours do you think you put into putting 1 out?
When I originally started, I probably put in 20 to sometimes maybe 30 hours for 1 show, because of the fact that I was trying to understand who the right audience would be, or the guest, developing the discussion guide based on a lot of research of that particular individual. Then you have the interview itself. Then you are editing it. Even though I used a company to help me do this, because I knew that I didn't want to learn to be an audio engineer, and I found ways where I could use a company, I was extremely particular in editing out my words or the guest words or moving the story around. It's just because of my need for perfection, which I've started to let go. But there's a lot of that, and the back and forth and listening to it and picking the right music and so forth. But certainly I've become much more efficient, but it's also me being comfortable with what is good enough.
Do you have a producer or somebody to assist you? Even now?
I do, but I found a very streamlined way in doing it, and the technology resources since I started. So I started in 2017. So I've seen the progression as well. And there are so many more ways to help you be certainly much more efficient and streamlined in doing that than there were when I first started.
Yeah. Xine, do you have support still?
It's just me and Liz. And so because of that, like, we're full-time academics, and being a full-time academic, it means you're working evenings and weekends on top of doing podcasting. So I think my approach is much more messy than how wonderfully polished everyone else's podcasts are, but maybe I'm here to help represent the messiness. There's a saying in academia that the best dissertation is a done dissertation, and there's just being a perfect dissertation and a done dissertation. I think that goes with so many things in life. It goes with like any sort of work that you're doing, and I think it goes with podcasting. And so for me, it's really about just getting content out there when I can and when we can, and also to be attentive when we need rest. And I think at the beginning, it was important to have consistency to build up an initial audience. But since then, we take breaks when we need to take breaks. We create more content when we do have content to create, but don't tend to be too fussed about it.
And Stephanie, do you have you've got a huge volume in your archive already? Do you have a schedule that you keep?
Well, I definitely want to caution against pod fading, which is a huge thing because you just get so burnt out. I joke that, but it's kind of true that my entire team are people that feel sorry for me in my life. But really, it started out as myself and my husband, we knew nothing about editing. And then I said, I really, really need help if I'm going to continue this cadence. And so this is where community and support really, really come in, because I have an elementary school friend who's actually an audio video, producer and editor. And I was like, can you please help me? And the people on our team are just so selfless. It's not like, oh, I want to get paid this amount of money. It's, hey, yeah, let's help out. Let's put out this content. And so I think it's really appealing to find folks that are supportive of your message. And also going back to that whole idea of don't be afraid to ask for help, because there are people out there.
Yeah, I know we're running up against the top of the hour, but I do want to get in if we could do just a couple things here. What are your favorite podcasts? At least if you guys have one each. What are your favorite podcasts that you admire or you want to emulate?
I'll start. I actually love listening to Bruce Lee's episode on confidence. That one is really great. Just talks about, what he did to build confidence and things like that. So that's one of the episodes I like to listen to, especially when I'm not always 100% confident.
All right, Connie, who do you listen to?
Adam Grant, Work Life. I know he's had various other ones since then, but anything with Adam Grant on it, I love listening to it.
All right, Sign, do you listen to anyone else?
For something completely different, I listen to Planet Money because I know nothing about economics. And just like my podcast, I like learning from people who do things I have no idea about.
Yeah, no, I love Planet Money too. But it is a completely different line. Stephanie, who do you listen to?
So I already mentioned Selling the Couch, so I'll push Letter to My Ex, which literally she reads letters from other people that wrote to their ex, and it's very therapeutic and it's very short and has so much impact.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. And I just want to wrap up at the top of the hour with a comment from Helen Chiang Mao. She says, I don't have a question, but I just want to say, as a 53-year-old first-gen Chinese American woman, I really enjoy this webinar. I wish I heard and saw women like you back in the 80s and 90s when I was trying to figure out my place and purpose. At 53, Helen, you got a long way to go, babe. So I hope you have chartered one, but also that you take an opportunity to listen to all these women and their podcasts, because honestly, I think it provides really great perspective, maybe not even in your own arena, but how other women and Chinese American women have accomplished this, I think is impressive. And I find all four of you super impressive. And I thank you. I know that we are supposed to stop because it's already after 3:00 and David is going to crack the whip on us. But hey, there's also an opportunity to go back and listen to this later through the Chinese American Museum's different platforms. So David, thank you for letting us all talk here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm always the guy that appears to end the party. But I would like to thank Joie and Sheena, Connie, Dr. Wong, and Dr. Yao. This has really been terrific. Just to note that this webinar has been made possible through the generous support of Ting Shu and James Shu of Evergreen Enterprises. And the links that we're showing here, you should be able to see, will be made available to all event registrants over email on our website, and also when the recording of this event gets to our YouTube channel, which is typically in a few days. So just thank you so much to you all, and to everybody, have a really great day.